Ever feel like, the world is just kind of teetering, on the edge of chaos? Like everything we thought was solid is suddenly shifting right beneath our feet. It's a pretty universal feeling these days, I think.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, so today we're taking a deep dive into Psalms 11 through 15,
Okay.
exploring how to find that unshakable foundation, even when the world feels like it's falling apart.
Yeah, these ancient poems speak directly to that, feeling of unease, that human cry of, "How long, O Lord?" It's like
Mm.
the poets themselves are grappling with the same anxieties and uncertainties that we experience today,
It's just so true.
It really is timeless.
Let's dive right in with Psalm 11.
Yep.
It starts with this powerful declaration, "In the Lord I put my trust." It's more than just a feel-good statement, though, right?
Absolutely. Psalm 11 isn't just about stating trust. It's about exploring what that trust looks like when everything around you feels shaky.
Mm.
It's like the psalmist is saying, look, I'm choosing to anchor myself in God even when the storms are raging.
That makes sense, but how does that actually play out? I mean, how do we anchor ourselves in something we can't see or touch when the news cycle feels like a constant barrage of bad news?
Verse 4 paints this vivid picture. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. It's not about ignoring the chaos on earth. It's about acknowledging a greater reality, a divine perspective that transcends our limited view.
So it's like zooming out from the immediate crisis and remembering that there's a much larger picture unfolding that we might not fully grasp in the moment.
Exactly. And recognizing that God's power and authority aren't bound by the limitations of our human understanding. Think about it. The psalmist isn't saying, God, please fix this mess so I can feel better.
Right.
It's more like, God, I'm choosing to trust your purpose and plan, even when I don't understand what you're doing.
I see. So instead of just asking God to change our circumstances, it's about shifting our own perspective, anchoring ourselves in the truth of his sovereignty. What strikes you about that perspective?
What's fascinating is that it offers a path to inner peace, even when external circumstances are turbulent. It's not about denying the reality of suffering or hardship, but rather choosing to place our trust in a source of strength that can't be shaken by the storms of life.
But then we move to Psalm 12, and the tone shifts a bit. It's like the psalmist has encountered another kind of chaos, one that hits a little closer to home. We hear this cry, "Help, Lord, for the godly are no more. The faithful have vanished from among men." What's happening here?
Psalm 12 takes aim at a different kind of threat, one that's all too familiar to us: deception. The world described here is one where honesty and integrity are in short supply, where flattering lips and double talk have become the norm.
Wow. It's like the psalmist is describing our modern world where we're constantly bombarded with spin manipulation and fake news. It can be really hard to know what to believe or who to trust, especially online.
And the psalmist isn't just lamenting this state of affairs, he's calling out the consequences. Look at verse 3. The Lord will cut off all flattering lips, the tongue that speaks proud things. It's a stark warning that deception, even when disguised as flattery or smooth talk, ultimately has a price.
So how does this ancient psalm about deception speak to us today? How can we stay grounded in truth when it feels like everyone is trying to manipulate us, whether it's politicians, advertisers, or even influencers on social media?
This psalm is a call to radical authenticity, to be people whose words and actions align even when it's costly. It's about choosing integrity over manipulation, even if it feels like honesty puts you at a disadvantage in the short term.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like the psalmist is saying, hey, God sees through the facades and he calls us to do the same. But living with integrity in a world that often rewards superficiality and spin, that's a tall order. How do we even begin to navigate that tension?
It starts with recognizing the corrosive power of deception, both in ourselves and in the world around us. When we buy into the lie that images everything, that success is measured by likes and followers, we become vulnerable to manipulation.
So we need to develop a kind of truth radar, so we're not constantly falling prey to empty promises and manipulative tactics.
Yep.
But what about those times when the chaos isn't external, when it comes from within? Like when we're struggling with doubt, fear, and uncertainty.
That's where Psalm 13 comes in.
Yeah.
It takes us to a much more vulnerable place, a place where we hear the raw, unfiltered cry of the human heart wrestling with doubt and despair.
It starts with this gut-wrenching question. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? What do you think David was feeling when he wrote those words?
I think he was experiencing that profound sense of abandonment, that feeling that God had gone silent, that his prayers were bouncing off the ceiling. It's a feeling many of us can relate to, that sense of being overwhelmed by life's challenges and wondering if God even cares.
Yes. This psalm doesn't shy away from those difficult emotions. It names them, it owns them, it brings them honestly before God. It's raw, it's real, it's deeply human.
And that's what makes this psalm so powerful. It gives us permission to bring our own doubts and fears to God, to lay bare our brokenness and vulnerability without pretense. We don't have to pretend we have it all together.
But then there's this remarkable shift towards the end of the psalm. Almost like a glimmer of light breaking through the darkness, David declares, "But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation." How do we move from that pit of despair to this place of trust and hope?
It's not about denying the reality of our pain or pretending that everything is okay when it's not. It's about choosing to cling to the truth of God's character even when we don't feel his presence or understand his plan.
So even when doubt screams the loudest, we can choose to whisper a prayer of trust. It sounds like an incredibly difficult yet incredibly powerful choice.
It is. It's a choice to ground ourselves in the truth of who God is, not just on our fleeting emotions or circumstances. It's about remembering his faithfulness in the past, his promises for the future, and trusting that he is working even when we can't see it. We've explored how trust in God can be an anchor, in the midst of external chaos and internal turmoil.
Right.
But what happens when people reject the very idea of God? That's where Psalm 14 takes us.
This psalm pulls no punches. It starts with a bold statement. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. It feels a bit jarring after the raw vulnerability of Psalm 13. What's going on here?
Psalm 14 tackles a fundamental question. What are the implications of living as if there is no higher power, no ultimate accountability? It's a sobering exploration of what happens when humanity decides it can define its own reality, its own morality.
And the psalmist isn't painting a rosy picture. Verse 3 is pretty bleak. They are all corrupt and their deeds are vile. There is no one who does good, not even one. Does this mean that everyone who doesn't believe in God is inherently bad or corrupt?
It's important to remember that this psalm is exploring a philosophical concept, not making sweeping judgments about individuals.
Right.
It's asking, what happens to society when we reject the notion of a moral compass that transcends our own desires and opinions?
That's an interesting distinction. So it's not about condemning individuals, but rather about exploring the potential consequences of a worldview that denies God's existence.
Exactly. Imagine a world where there are no absolute truths, no objective standards of right and wrong, where every individual decides for themselves what's good and what's evil. The psalmist suggests that such a world would quickly descend into chaos and corruption.
It makes you think about the role of faith in shaping our understanding of morality. If we believe that God is the source of goodness and truth, how does that belief inform our actions, our choices, our interactions with others?
That's a key question, and I think it leads us naturally to Psalm 15, which acts as a kind of answer to the bleakness of Psalm 14. If denying God leads to chaos, what does a life that honors God look like?
Psalm 15 poses the question directly. Lord, who may dwell in your sanctuary, who may live on your holy hill. It's like the psalmist is saying, okay, if rejecting God has these consequences, what does it take to live a life that is pleasing to him?
And the answer is both simple and profound. Verse 2 tells us, he whose walk is blameless and who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from his heart, and has no slander on his tongue, who does his neighbor no wrong, and casts no slur on his fellow man.
It's like a blueprint for righteous living, for a life that reflects the character of God.
Yeah.
But what does that look like in practice? It can feel overwhelming to try to live up to these ideals.
It is a high calling, but it's not about achieving some impossible standard of perfection. It's about aligning our hearts and actions with God's values day in and day out. Think about it. The psalm doesn't just focus on grand gestures or heroic deeds. It zeroes in on everyday actions and interactions. How we speak, how we treat others, how we conduct our business.
So it's about those small, consistent choices, those seemingly insignificant moments where we choose integrity over convenience, kindness over apathy, truth over deception. It's about living out our faith in the mundane details of life.
Precisely. It's about cultivating habits of honesty, generosity, and compassion. It's about being the kind of person who keeps their word, who stands up for the vulnerable, who chooses to speak words that build others up rather than tear them down.
So it's not just about what we believe, but about how we live, how we treat others, how we conduct ourselves in the world. Those are values that transcend religious boundaries.
Absolutely. These principles resonate with something deep within us, something that speaks to our longing for justice, for kindness, for a world where people treat each other with dignity and respect.
But let's get practical.
Yeah.
We've laid out this beautiful blueprint for righteous living. But how do we actually apply these principles when we're bombarded with temptations, distractions, and pressures that pull us in the opposite direction?
That's where the rubber meets the road. And these Psalms offer some practical guidance. Remember Psalm 11, where the psalmist talks about God testing the righteous? It's a reminder that living with integrity doesn't mean we'll escape challenges or temptations. In fact, it often means we'll face even greater opposition.
So it's about preparing ourselves for those battles, for
Yep.
those moments when our values are tested, when the easy path leads away from what we know is right.
Exactly. And Psalm 12 warns us about the dangers of deception, both in the world around us and within our own hearts. We need to be vigilant about guarding our minds and hearts against influences that could lead us astray.
So it's about being mindful of what we allow into our mental and emotional space, what we read, what we watch, what we listen to, what conversations we engage in. It's about curating our mental diets just like we try to eat healthy foods.
That's a great analogy. And just like with our physical diets, it's about making intentional choices, not just mindlessly consuming whatever's put in front of us. It's about asking, is this content nourishing my soul, or is it feeding negativity, fear, or unhealthy desires?
It's so easy to get swept up in the negativity, especially in the digital age where we're constantly bombarded with bad news, outrage, and drama. How do we stay grounded in truth and hope when it feels like the world is spinning out of control?
One powerful practice is to cultivate a habit of gratitude. When we focus on what we're grateful for, it shifts our perspective away from negativity and helps us see the good even in difficult circumstances. Think about those moments when you felt overwhelmed by anxiety or fear. What happens when you pause to simply acknowledge the good things in your life, no matter how small?
It's like a mental reset button. It shifts our focus from what's wrong to what's right, from what's lacking to what's abundant. But what about those times when gratitude feels impossible, when you're facing real hardship, grief, or loss?
Those are the times when gratitude can be the most challenging, yet the most powerful. It's not about denying the pain or pretending that everything is okay. It's about finding those glimmers of light, those small things we can still be thankful for, even in the midst of darkness.
It reminds me of the story of Corrie ten Boom, who survived a Nazi concentration camp. She talked about how even in that horrific situation, she and her sister chose to be grateful for things like a smuggled Bible, a shared blanket, a ray of sunshine through the bars.
It's a profound example of how gratitude can be an act of resistance, a way to choose hope, even in the face of despair. It's about recognizing that even in our darkest moments, God's grace is still present. His love still surrounds us. His goodness still shines through.
So gratitude is a powerful tool for navigating the chaos, both internal and external. But what about those messy, complicated relationships where we've been hurt, betrayed, or wronged? How does righteous living play out in those situations?
That's where forgiveness comes in. Psalm 15 talks about walking blamelessly and doing what is right. And I think forgiveness is an essential part of that. When we hold on to bitterness, resentment, and anger, it poisons our hearts and hinders our ability to live in a right relationship with God and others.
Forgiveness is one of those things that sounds great in theory, but it can be incredibly difficult to put into practice, especially when we've been deeply hurt. How do we even begin to forgive someone who has wronged us, especially when they haven't acknowledged their actions or apologized?
It's important to remember that forgiveness isn't about condoning the other person's actions or pretending that what they did was okay. It's not about letting them off the hook or saying that their behavior was acceptable.
So it's not about excusing the wrong or minimizing the hurt.
Exactly. Forgiveness is about releasing the anger and resentment that we're holding on to so that we can move forward in freedom and peace. It's about choosing to break the cycle of pain and bitterness that keeps us bound to the past.
But how do we actually do that releasing? How do we move from a place of hurt and anger to a place of forgiveness, especially when the other person hasn't even acknowledged their wrongdoing?
It's a process, not a one-time event. And it often involves wrestling with difficult emotions, acknowledging the pain, and choosing to let go of the desire for revenge or retribution.
It sounds like an incredibly difficult journey. What are some practical steps we can take to move in the direction of forgiveness?
One powerful practice is to pray for the person who has hurt you. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but praying for someone who has wronged us can be incredibly healing.
How does that work? It seems like the last thing we'd want to do when we're hurting.
When we pray for someone who has hurt us, we're choosing to see them through God's eyes, to recognize their humanity, their brokenness, their need for grace. We're asking God to work in their lives to soften their hearts, to bring healing to the situation.
So it's about shifting our perspective, choosing to see the person not just as the perpetrator of hurt, but as someone who is also in need of God's grace and forgiveness.
Exactly. And as we pray for them, we often find that our own hearts begin to soften. We start to see them less as an enemy and more as a fellow human being who is struggling just like we are.
It sounds like praying for the person who has hurt us can be a key to unlocking our own hearts to forgiveness. What other practices can help us move towards forgiveness?
Another helpful practice is to write a letter to the person expressing your hurt and anger. You don't have to send the letter, but the act of writing it out can be a powerful way to process your emotions and release them.
So it's about acknowledging the pain, giving it a voice, but not allowing it to control us or define our future.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as you write the letter, imagine yourself releasing those feelings of hurt and anger to God. Picture yourself placing that burden at the foot of the cross, trusting that He can handle it, that He can bring healing and restoration in His time.
It sounds like forgiveness is ultimately an act of surrender, of releasing our grip on the past and trusting God to work in the situation.
It is. And remember, forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. It's about freeing yourself from the burden of bitterness and resentment so that you can live with greater peace and joy.
This has been so helpful. We've talked about guarding our hearts and minds, cultivating gratitude, and practicing forgiveness. All these practices seem to involve an element of intentionality, of making conscious choices about how we want to live, how we want to respond to the challenges we face.
You're right. Living righteously isn't about passively following a set of rules. It's about actively engaging with our faith, making choices that align with God's values, and allowing Him to transform our hearts and minds.
And that transformation often plays out in our actions, in the way we treat others, in the way we use our words, our resources, and our influence.
Absolutely. Remember Psalm 15 where it talks about not slandering with our tongues, not doing evil to our neighbor, not taking a bribe against the innocent. These aren't just abstract moral principles. They're concrete actions that reflect a heart that is aligned with God's justice and righteousness.
So it's about putting our faith into action, about translating those internal values into tangible deeds.
Exactly. It's about living in a way that demonstrates the reality of God's love and justice in the world. It's about being a good neighbor, a trustworthy friend, a responsible citizen, a person of integrity.
Okay, those are big words, but can you give us some specific examples of what that might look like in everyday life? What does it mean to do no evil to our neighbor in the 21st century?
It could be as simple as choosing to speak words of kindness and encouragement, rather than gossip or criticism. It could mean being generous with our time and resources, volunteering at a local soup kitchen, or donating to a cause that supports those experiencing homelessness.
So it's about being mindful of our words, our actions, and how they impact others.
Exactly. And it's about making choices that reflect our values even when no one is watching. It's about refusing to participate in systems or structures that exploit or marginalize others. It's about standing up for what is right, even when it's unpopular or inconvenient.
I love that. It's about being a force for good in the world, about using our influence to make a positive impact, no matter how small.
And remember, living righteously isn't about achieving some impossible standard of perfection. We're all going to mess up. We're all going to make mistakes. But the beauty of God's grace is that it covers our failures and empowers us to get back up and keep trying.
So it's not about being perfect, but about being persistent, about continuing to choose righteousness even when we stumble and fall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
About surrendering our hearts to God, asking for His guidance, and allowing Him to work in and through us to bring about His purposes in the world.
This has been such a rich and challenging conversation. We've covered so much ground. Trusting God in the midst of chaos, guarding our hearts and minds, cultivating gratitude, practicing forgiveness, and putting our faith into action. But there's one more crucial element I want to explore: accountability. How can we practically build that into our lives, especially when it comes to living righteously?
That's a great question, and one that's essential for spiritual growth and personal transformation. I think it starts with finding people who share our values and who are committed to living with integrity.
So finding the right people, people we can trust and be vulnerable with. What else?
Be willing to be vulnerable. Share your struggles, your temptations, your areas where you need to grow. Ask for prayer encouragement and honest feedback.
Vulnerability is so important. It's about creating a safe space where we can be honest with ourselves and with others about our struggles. But what if we don't have that kind of community around us? What if we feel isolated or alone in our pursuit of righteousness?
That's a tough situation, but it's not hopeless. You can start by seeking out online communities or groups that share your values. There are many online forums, podcasts, and social media groups dedicated to spiritual growth and righteous living.
That's a great tip. It's amazing how technology can connect us with like-minded people, even across geographical boundaries.
It is. And remember, even if you don't have a close-knit community right now, You can still be intentional about cultivating accountability in your life. You can set personal goals, track your progress, and find creative ways to hold yourself accountable.
I love that. It's about taking ownership of our own growth, even if we don't have a strong support system in place.